What's going on, everybody? David Elliott here, and in today's video, we're going to do a full underwriting on a seller finance prospect deal. This is going to be part 3 of our mini course series for underwriting. So let's jump right in. I've got a property of interest here that I had found through Zillow, and this is it right here on your screen. And just by the looks of it, you can see that this property was fully renovated. It's a beautiful property. There's nothing that needs to be done to it. It's completely rent ready. And this is a seller finance prospect deal. The reason that I know that is a seller finance opportunity is because according to PropStream has reported to me that there is no mortgage associated with the property. So being that there's no mortgage associated with the property, this is a seller finance deal. Now, should there be any type of liens associated with the property, such as an HOA or a tax lien, whatever money is received at closing by the seller would simply be taken off the difference of the lien amount. In this case, there is no lien amount, as there is no lien to begin with, and there is no mortgage. And so we have an opportunity here for seller finance. So what we are going to do is go back into Zillow. I can see here that Zillow, it puts in a market value estimate of about 285.6. And what we're going to do is check the market value with Redfin. So let's put this into Redfin and double check that Redfin is receiving a similar estimate. And according to Redfin, we're looking at about 296. 296 according to Redfin. And according to Zillow, we're looking at 285. So what we're going to do is take the middle number, which would be about 290, and we're going to say that the market value for this property at this moment in time is going to be around the 290 mark. So that's going to be the first thing that we're going to put in on our calculator is going to be 290. The second thing that we could plug in is the encumbrance. In this case, it's 0, and it's already set at 0. Should there be a lien associated with the property, let's say there was a lien for $5,000, you would include that as part of the encumbrance. In this case, there is no lien. The next thing that we could fill out is the agent commission. It's going to be a standard 3%. And let's go back into Zillow, take a look at the rental values here. We can click on market value. And under market value, we will see the rent estimate. Now, according to Zillow, we're seeing a rent estimate of about $1,700 a month. Maybe you could get a little bit more at $1,800, considering that this property is fully renovated. Maybe even closer to $2,000. But we are not going to do a full comp right now. We're going to first pre-underwrite the deal. And by pre-underwriting, I'm going to be a little pessimistic on the rent and say that it's going to be closer to $1,600. So let's put in $1,600 for the rental. Now let's go back into our cash versus creative side. If you are working with a private investor or a hedge fund, they may be willing to pay a large amount of cash for a property such as this, considering that there's nothing to do with it, it is rent ready. If you have those types of connections and you know somebody or yourself who's willing to pay a large amount of money on cash, regardless of what the cap rate might be in that area, by all means, you can throw in that cash number. For our purposes and demonstrations, we are going to try and get the seller to pivot away from a cash offer and into accepting a creative offer. And I'm going to do that by giving them 85% cash, 85% of the current market value on cash. And so we're going to now throw in our typical sales fee of best case scenario, 3% towards the agent commission, 1% towards closing costs. We're going to put in a tax rate of about 15%. That's going to be pretty typical for long-term ownership of a property. And because I want to incentivize the seller to consider creative, I'm going to come up above the market value. But if I come up above the market value, I want to put a cap. I want to make sure that I'm not overpaying for the property to the point where I might be underwater in terms of equity for 3-4 years down the road. So let's put in a cap at 5%. Most properties across the United States are going to appreciate 5% year over year. So 5% would be a good standard to stick to. If you really wanted to get that seller to say yes to your seller finance deal, the highest I would go is 10% over the current market value, and just make sure that you're extending that balloon out long enough so that the market value of that property in that area has time to catch up to you overpaying for today's value. So let's go back down to 5% because we're not going to go into the 10% territory unless we were really wanting to do a deal. So at 5% cap, that would put us at about $15,000 over the current market value. So the seller is going to be receiving $305 on creative versus a cash offer of $246.5. Why did I pick 85%? Because 85% is typical when it comes to cash. Most cash buyers are going to be paying anywhere between 60 and 70% of the ARV. Now, considering that this property is already fully renovated, I am going to make the presumption that the ARV is already what it's listed at, and it's listed at $299. In fact, I feel like the ARV might even be less than that. It might be closer to $295 or $290. So let's put in $295 down below here on our ARV. Let's take a look at the last sold price since we're already in that cell. Let's go back into our Zillow listing. Let's go to market value. We were actually in the right spot. We just needed to scroll down. It was last sold for $125. So clearly this property here was clearly a flip. We'll plug in $125 on the last sold price. Is this something that's needed? Is this something that you need to input into this calculator? No, it's not. But I like to get an idea of what the taxable gain might be for the seller. So if I'm having a conversation with the seller and I want to incentivize them to consider creative for tax reasons, it might be a calculation that I might be able to include in the incentivizing the seller to consider creative versus a cash or traditional offer. So in this case, their tax gain is going to be closer to $165, as it's going to be taking the sold price. Let's say they were able to sell it at the $290 mark as opposed to $299. Subtract that from the last sold price of $125. That means they have a total gross gain of $165, and you then multiply the $165 by the 15%. Now, am I going to go through that entire conversation with the seller on the phone or with the agent? Absolutely not. That is not my job. That is the CPA's job. My job is to give the seller a broad overview of what they can expect versus cash versus creative. And so now that we're in the creative column here, why don't we just continue on with this? Our sales fee for creative is going to be about 3.7%. We're going to give them 30% down as our down payment. The reason why I'm giving them 30% down is that's because it's 10%. Typically, I will not go past 12% on the down payment to this seller. 10% seems to be just about right. So let's see. We've got a seller carryback of now $260,000. So the seller carryback is being calculated by the $290 market value at that time, subtracting the down payment, subtracting the encumbrance, and we've got a seller carryback of $260. Now you might be saying, well, David, that doesn't sound right. Shouldn't the seller carryback be coming from the $305 mark? Well, if you're going to be doing a traditional seller finance, yes, but we are not going to do a traditional seller finance. We're going to do a reverse seller finance, and you will see shortly why. Now, let's take a look at the estimated deal projection. As long as the approximate cash flow here is above $200, I know that this is going to work out on the long term with underwriting. So $200 is the minimum cash flow needed from the stress test to know whether or not we can go from pre-underwriting to a full underwriting. And remember, we're taking a pessimistic cash flow of $1,600 a month. This could easily go for $1,900 a month considering that it's fully renovated. But we want to look at things in the worst case scenario first when we are doing some pre-underwriting. That way, when we are going into our full underwriting, we have the confidence to know that when we are underwriting from this calculator down below, that everything will work out fine. So let's move forward. The next thing to look at is our yearly taxes. Now, you can get tax information from two different sites. depending on whether you're working on market or off market. If you're working in on market properties such as Zillow, you can head on over to the cost calculator, and the cost calculator will have the property taxes. Now, according to Zillow, the property taxes are going to be about $230. Because we have access to PropStream, though, we're going to take the taxes from here, as the tax information for PropStream seems to be more reliable and accurate. Now, according to PropStream, we see property taxes from 2022 at about $560. So let's go based off of the $560. If we need to adjust during the due diligence period of final underwriting and we find out the property taxes is less, then we can adjust then. But for the time being, let's put in property taxes at the $560 mark. That puts our yearly insurance at about $280. How the yearly insurance is being calculated is that it's being calculated by approximately half of the yearly taxes. Now, this will also get adjusted during final underwriting, or even when you decide to pick your own insurance company to cover the property. Next thing that we will look at is the fees associated with managing and repair reserves. Now, typical management fees are going to be ranging between 6 and 12%, and your repair reserves can range from anywhere from 5 to 10% as well. So for a management fee, let's go with the standard 10%. For repair reserves, this property is fully renovated. There is nothing to do with it. So let's put a lower amount on the repair reserves for about 6% here. And this is going to be the yearly amount that's being pushed to the side in case we need to fix something on the property and also to pay our property manager. How this is being calculated is that it's taking the yearly amount and then it's just taking 10%. Super simple. Now, over here you see a little comment that the minimum balloon in years should be 5% minimum. Could we go below 5-year balloon? Absolutely we can. We could do a 3-year balloon, but if we were to do a 3-year balloon, our terms here would have to be extremely well played out. It's more likely that a 5-year term is going to be a more reasonable time frame to allow the property to appreciate. So one could do a refinance on the property, do some sort of home equity line of credit, sell the property altogether. 5 years seems to be about the average sweet spot. Now let's take a look here at the payment structure to the seller, because this is going to be very important. The loan amount here is looking at the seller carryback of $260. If we take a look at the loan amount for $260, we see here that it's taking the current market value at the time minus the down payment minus the encumbrance to get us a seller carryback of $260. Now, technically, the seller carryback should be based off of the price that you are agreeing with the seller, which is $305. But the reason why we are not going to do that is if we were to base it off of the $305 for the seller carryback, it's going to push my loan amount higher. And the moment that I start to apply interest on this loan, the amount being received by the seller is going to go over the $305. Now, I've already had an agreement, a pre-agreement, not with the seller, but a pre-agreement according to the calculations that I would not go past $15,000 over the current market value. So in a reverse seller finance, what we're looking to do is control the total paid to the seller. If we do it the traditional route of a normal seller finance, the moment that we apply 1% interest, regardless of the balloon in years, we are going to overpay for the property. Okay? The total paid to the seller is going to be $317,000 after 5 years, even at a 1% interest. Now, in what world is the seller going to agree to a 1% interest? So let me take a picture of this as a comparison. We're going to come back to this in a little while. I'm going to move this screenshot over to my other screen here, and we're going to change the loan amount from $275 to what we had originally. So for seller carryback, let's take the $305 from $290 market value, and now this is going to be our seller carryback. Loan amount is going to be $260,000. Now, if we were to apply 1% interest here, we're going to be at 302. I've had an agreement to go to 305. Let's move this up by another percentage point to see how far we can get. Okay, it looks like I will be able to do approximately 1.25% interest. Now you can see just by making a small modification, the interest portion went up, which is what's going to be seen and viewed by the seller. And paying interest on a seller finance deal would be a good thing for the buyer, as we have the ability to use that as a tax deduction against the gross income being received by the property. Now, I want to structure this in a way where we can incentivize the seller to take a creative deal. Now, the 5% cap limit is really the sweet spot where you don't want to overpay. But for the sake of example, let's go up to 10% here. So let's change this to 10% cap. And now we can come up to 320 on the creative side of the purchase price. So let's manipulate our interest rate now to, let's say, 2%. We could actually go a little bit higher. Let's go up to 2.5. And it looks like we're just about there. Let's see if we can get that 320 to kind of even out. So let's put that at 2.4, 2.45, 2.48. Okay, let's come back down, 2.47, 2.46. All right, this is perfect. So what I'm doing here is manipulating the interest that's being received by the seller so that the total payment going to the seller would be 320. I do not want to manipulate, I do not want to overpay more for the property than what I've already agreed to. So in a scenario like this, where I have had a pre-agreement that I am willing to pay them 10% over asking price, I want to be able to control the payment being received at the end of the balloon, and really the total payment received to the seller. In this case, it would be 320. If we bring back our other window here that we had saved, we had an original loan amount here of 275. The moment that we started to apply interest, recall that we went from a 305 paid to the seller to 317. The moment that interest was applied, the only way to get the seller to accept the 305 that we originally had was to do principal only payments. Now that's never going to happen. So this is what we call a reverse seller finance. How this is going to work is that we are going to base the loan amount off of the current market value of the property minus the down payment minus the encumbrance. In this case, you get to a loan amount of 260. By doing a slight tweak in this manner, it gives me so much flexibility in terms of controlling the amount of money being received by the seller. And if I were to show this payment structure to the seller, I could then show them that they are receiving 2.46% interest as opposed to 1% interest. Or maybe this is just a zero altogether, because we were trying to pay a principal balance of 305. So what sounds better on paper? 2.46% interest or 0% interest to the seller in principal only payments? What do you think the seller is going to agree to? I think the seller is going to want some kind of an interest on their property. And so this is how it would be done. Now, you might see this special terminology over here where it says specialized return. This is also another thing that is unique about this calculator here. The return value of 11.57%. How this is being calculated is that it's taking the total interest received by the seller over the course of a 5-year balloon. In this case, it's $30,000 of total interest received by the seller over a 5-year balloon. And it is then dividing that from the loan origination amount. So we can see 260 as our denominator, and our interest amount received by the seller as the numerator. And so when a seller is going to receive our calculations through the LOI, they're actually not even going to see the payment structure here in terms of the interest rate. Instead, what they're going to see is this 12%, and that is done intentionally. We want to incentivize the seller to take a creative offer. Now, there's no manipulation of the math here where someone's trying to trick somebody. There's no trickery at play. This is real world math. We are saying that the total interest being received by the seller, divide that by the loan origination amount, is going to be roughly a 12% return over the course of 5 years. That would be the same way as me saying I'm going to put my money in a checking account, or I'm going to put my money in the stock market, and I'm going to wait until I have a total gain of, let's say, maybe 4% year over year. And so what we're doing here is we're telling the seller that you are going to receive 12% gain over the next 5 years. Now, that could be a really good gain for most people, because most people just have their money in a traditional checking account and they're getting probably 0.25% every single year from their tax savings account. So that's terrible. So this is how we are able to do a reverse seller finance. Now, I want you to take a quick look here at the monthly cash flow. Remember my stress test. Remember how I told you that the stress test is looking at the approximate cash flow after the expenses, and we said anything over $200 on that stress test is going to allow us to know that we have a deal that's worth underwriting. Well, guess what? Our cash flow is going to be $252. Now, our cash on cash percentage is a little bit lower. It's going to be at 8.45, but that's because we're using a pessimistic value of $1,600 a month. This property is probably going to go for $1,900 a month as a long-term rental. And now we're looking at a cash flow of $500 a month with a almost 17% cash on cash return. Mind you, that is still calculating. This number is still being calculated with the property management fee and with the repair reserves. So if you get rid of the repair reserves and you're just looking at total gross, you're looking at $800 a month at a best case scenario. But we're not going to do that. We're going to be realistic here and say that $1,600 is going to be a pessimistic value. But I just wanted to show you that based off of the stress test, now we know that we have a deal worth underwriting. So what did we learn here? That structuring seller finance deals on paper matter. If we were to structure the loan amount based off of the 305, we would be greatly overpaying for the property. Now, your question might be, okay, David, if you're trying to control the back end total profit being received by the seller, what is the sales price of the property going to be? Well, great question. If that was your question, the sales price of the property is going to be the $290, because that is today's current market value. The 3% commission that the agent's going to receive, I have no problem giving them 3% off of the 305. Or in this case, it would be 320. So let's actually bump that up, because we never updated that. Let's go $30,000 over. So in this case, the agent commission would be $9,600 for simply presenting a created deal to the seller. They are going to walk away with nearly $3,000 more than a cash or conventional offer at 85% of the total market value. It's a $3,000 difference on the commission side. The sales price will be $290. The loan amount, which will now be the promissory note, which will then be linked to a security deed or some sort of security instrument, depending on the state that you're working in. These are the numbers that the attorney is going to receive. These are the numbers that the title company is going to see. And this is also numbers that you could share with the seller should they ask. Now, the monthly payment to the seller is going to be $1,000. $1,000 a month payment to the seller is quite a lot. Our gross income, based off of our gross income, you are giving the seller almost 65% of the gross income that you are receiving off of that rental, that's going straight to the seller's pocket. So 60% is actually a lot. So what we might want to do here is actually reduce that interest percentage, because it is going to control the monthly payment that is being received to the seller. Let's see if we can get that down maybe closer to 50%. But if we do that, mind you, that by doing so, monthly payment to the seller is going to go down. Interest on paper that's being returned to the seller's LOI is also going to be significantly less. But it really comes down on what are you going to do with the property, right? We saw that even at the original numbers of 2.46% interest rate, we were still going to cash flow. And even at the worst case scenario, $1,600 a month, we were still pulling $250, I believe it was, the cash flow. And we know that we could get $1,900. But if you don't want to give all that amount of percentage of that gross income to the seller, then simply just come on down to, let's say, 50%. Let's see what that would be. So that's 49%. I'm going to manipulate this until we are at 50%. Okay, this is taking a lot longer than I had anticipated. There we are, 0.63. So a 0.63 interest rate that is received by the seller would be the equivalent of $792. $792 a month if you were trying to target a specified gross income or gross percentage of your gross income. That would be 50% of whatever the rental value is. In this case, we're not going to do that. We're going to go back to our 2.46, I think it was. And these are the numbers that we are going to stick with. So we're going to stick with these numbers here. At the very bottom, we see a interest-only loan calculator. I am going to say that this is not going to be used all that often, but it is here in case you decide to use it. So our calculations are pretty much done, where these are numbers that we can send out on our LOI to the seller. So let's go back to our Zillow listing, and we are going to enter these details now into our master tab like we were doing before. So we see the listing's name is Pauline. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go into our master tab. It's going to then auto update into row 38. This is going to be a seller finance deal. Let's say that it's going to be Pauline at gmail.com. Let's pull her email. Her phone number. Her email address you can find through Google. You can find her email through simply texting or contacting the brokerage. In our scenario, we're not going to waste our time trying to find her email. Let's find out what that property address was. 1391 Lorenzo Drive. So let's just we don't need to take the Southwest. We'll just copy and paste that. Throw that into our property address here. Click enter. And now we head on over to the hybrid tab. The seller finance tab is the one that you want to be under. Now, the numbers that were generated prior through our pre-underwriting, they're going to be fixated here on the LOI. So this is ready to go. Now, if you wanted to show the seller the amount of money being received, you can. In this case, you might not want to because they're going to see a large negative red number. So that is why I include this little text box here to kind of just get this out of the picture. And just recall that you'll have to delete this text before you send out the LOI. Otherwise, they're going to see what you had written here in the text box. This is just for demonstration purposes. But if you wanted to block this out, you could. So in this case, seller could get a cash offer of $246, which we said was going to be 85% of the current market value, or they could take a $320 offer on creative terms. So that would be 10% over market value. So is this an offer that the seller might consider? possible. It certainly cash flows, even at a $1,600 pessimistic rent. So if we go through the LOI, we can see that everything's just being auto-generated for you. You can manipulate this however you want. And now we see the payment to the seller. So remember, the payment structure is not going to be necessarily reported, which includes the interest rate to the seller. If they were to ask you what that is, you could. But what we are going to do is we're going to report the total gain. Now, a total gain of 12% sounds a heck of a lot better than reporting a 2.46% annual interest rate. Which is the bigger number, 12 or 2.46? So reporting 12% total gain could sound a lot better on paper, and it's certainly going to incentivize the seller to consider a creative offer. So we've got the payment breakdown here of $488 for principal, $533 for the interest. That information is coming off of these two tabs here. So it's just grabbing from the first month. Now, of course, principal will go up over time. Interest will go down over time. What we are simply doing is just showing them their highest return on the interest, which is $533 for the first month. So this is going to be the monthly payment to the seller. This will always be fixated. That will never change. We're going to have a balloon of 60 months. We can see the total interest collected, total principal collected, total due at the balloon in 5 years. Profit made is $320. And remember, we are controlling how much money is being received on the back end. If we do this any other way, which I will show you at the very end of this video, you're going to see that we are going to completely overpay for the property. And we don't want to do that. So this is what the seller is going to receive on this template. If you would like to include something else, you absolutely can. We'll have the advantages to the seller, your attorney's information, and any type of credibility. Once you're done with all of this, just reviewing it, be sure to indicate what your end row number is. In this case, my end row number is going to be, for the sake of example, let's say that my end row number is going to be 204. Let's give it an extra page here. Let's say that it's going to be 204 for the sake of example. So now what we're going to do is we're going to click Convert Text to PDF. Saw that how that just loaded. Before we click the Send Email button, let's go back over here to the Master tab. Let's change this body paragraph to the first sentence here. We are interested in purchasing your property. Today happens to be Thursday, so I'm going to include that in my text. To Pauline is her name. I'm going to increase the EMD to $3,000. We're going to do a 7-day due diligence period excluding Sundays, and these two parameters here can stay the same. That is the agent's email address. We simply guessed what that was. They'll have to go and find what her email is. I'm not going to BCC anybody on this email, so let's just click delete. And we don't need to have anybody BCC'd yet either, so we can click the delete button. So let's go over to the hybrid section. The seller finance tab. And now when we click send email, we've got the agent's name, which might actually be a real email, ironically enough. We've got the offer to the seller with the property address. We've got the PDF, which we are going to open up quickly. And we've got our body paragraph with the embedment of the property address that we are referring to. So everything's ready to go. You can see how easy that was in terms of just doing the math. And now we're going to be able to send out an LOI within a couple of minutes. Let's open up that PDF real quick, and then we'll go back to our calculator. So everything is here. I had added an additional page just for the sake of example. So make sure you are ending your LOI parameters at the appropriate mark where the last text, body paragraph, graph, whatever input is here, make sure you're ending the LOI letter at the appropriate area. In this case, the end row is 204. Let's go back to our cash versus created calculator. I'm going to take a screenshot of this, and I want to show you real quick before we end this video of why reverse seller finance is going to be the way moving forward. Okay, so if we have an agreement at $290, let's take the sales price of $290, let's take the sales price of $320. Let's say you agreed to a sales price of $320 on paper, and you gave them $30,000 down. That would put your loan amount at $290. Let's put the interest at 0%. Immediately, the total paid to the seller is going to be $320 without applying interest. Now, if we were to apply the same interest that we had before at 2.46%, you can see now that the total being received by the seller is going to be $353. So what does that equate to? Let's see what that equates to. That's going to be 22% over market value. So we don't want that to happen. So that is why we are going to control as doable as possible the amount of payment being received on the back end to the seller. So I'm going to click the backspace button here. Let's see if it goes right on back to normal. And this is what we originally had. So this is the better way of doing a seller finance deal. This ends part 2 of our underwriting. And in the next video, we're going to move into our hybrid scenario, the hybrid underwriting, which will be part 3.